in YouTube,
Yeah, I'll just watch it here.
and I'm going to do that as well. So I'm in that page. All right, welcome, folks. If you are seeing this, we are now live. We're not officially live yet on my YouTube page. I'm going to keep in a monitoring of that. There we go. We are up there. I'm going to mute that so I'm not listening to myself, but now I should also be able to hear the chat. So let's just test this out. Testing the chat. Cool. Did it appear here? Yeah. So do you see now on the right side of your screen that little box where it says comments? Oh, you may not have control.
Oh, okay. So I've been on people. That's why.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. You see that?
Go over.
I don't know. All right. Any other questions before we jump in?
No, just looking stuff up.
Cool. All right. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're giving you one of our member-only episodes. We're going behind the scenes. Today we're giving you one of our member-only episodes where we're continuing this idea of the core questions. What are the things that are kind of like fundamental to any discussion of superhero ethics? And one of the topics that I think comes up again and again and again, and so we wanted to dive into pretty early on, is that of accountability, of superhero accountability, of who are superheroes accountable to, if anyone, should they be accountable to anyone, what should happen when something goes wrong, should there be registration, should there be oversight bodies, should there be none of this, all of this, all those questions that sometimes get kind of summarized as Team Tony or Team Cap, but as we're going to talk about, are a lot more complicated than that. And we'll be using MCU's Civil War, both the comic books and the movie, and talking about some of the differences for those as a jumping off point. But we're not here to re-legislate what exactly happened in that movie or that comic book show or what should have happened. We're here to talk about this larger question of if there are people in the world who have powers far beyond what most of us have, and those people choose those powers to do their version of good, what should the rest of us do about it? And when something goes wrong, what should happen? I've got some kind of things I'm going to say to frame this discussion, but Riki, let's just starting out by that. Why don't you introduce yourself and give kind of your general thoughts on this topic and why you think it's an important one to discuss.
Yes, hello, Matthew, and listeners and chat, I guess. We are live here. I'm Riki. And for me, the most important thing about this is that for the longest time, superheroes were framed as good. I mean, they are, right? They're heroes. Right. But the idea that they were not accountable there was never any discussion baked into these stories about that for the longest time. It was just assumed that they're good because they are.
Right.
And then we got this shift, I want to say maybe starting in the 80s, late 80s, 90s, where we got more stories that were focused on, well, what if superheroes were bad, right? Like the Watchmen is one of those big moments in comic books where the whole industry really shifted around it. And I think it set the tone for a lot of the stories that came later, asking these questions, like, literally who watches the Watchmen?
Yeah.
And then it developed, and we get to the point of Civil War in the comic books. And then, of course, in the MCU, really put that on the map for mainstream media, especially the MCU version.
And I'll say that a long time ago on this podcast, we did a series of episodes with Jessica. Riki, is before you became a co-host, I believe. Yeah, she was long before, on the history of comic books. And one thing we talked about was that this moment in the late 70s, early 80s, where we started thinking about these questions a lot more, it's not coincidental that that's happening at a time when a lot of people are starting to ask, are the police always doing good? Is the military always doing good? And frankly, I mean, people have been asking those questions for a long time, but between the comics code that we've talked about, and McCarthyism and all sorts of stuff like that, those either weren't topics being discussed in mainstream America very much. It was thought of as like, oh, that's just the hippies, the liberals, their crazy ideas. Or it was ideas that you couldn't talk about in comic books and things like that. And so part of this, I think we'll talk about, there's always been this conversation about, are superheroes kind of stand-ins for the police or for the military or for something else? And it's not coincidence at the same time we start talking a lot more about, war crimes in Vietnam and police brutality, that we start also asking about superheroes, like, what if they are not always doing good or trying to do good, but bad things are happening?
Yeah, well, you said the 70s, and immediately my mind went to President Richard Nixon. Of course, the Watergate scandal and his ultimate resignation from the presidency really shook the country and the world to the core of this idea, like, the president committed crimes and
Right.
had to resign because of them. He was in the process probably of being impeached and being removed as president by Congress, and that really set the tone for the public's perception of people in power.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was always, you would always be critical of presidents, probably, like if you're an average citizen, be like, oh, I don't like this policy or that policy, but you accept their authority, like they're the president,
Right.
like they should be allowed to do all these things, etc. And that was the moment in history when people were like, wait a minute,
Right.
so you can't do that. Like, even if you're president, you can't do that. And of course, like, we are currently dealing with times where presidential power is once again being stretched and tested by the law. And we also coincidentally have a MCU story coming out. As of this recording, it's releasing tomorrow in theaters, Captain America Brave New World, where the president of the United States is like a villain figure in the
Right.
story,
Definitely.
and questioning his motives.
Now, before we jump into this too much, I do want to frame the discussion a little bit, which is saying that the questions of a lot of the questions we're going to discuss are questions that by nature are probably not going to be dived into in great degree in the media that we talk about themselves. And that's somewhat intentional. And it's part of what we like about this podcast, is kind of getting to dive into those. And with superheroes especially, I think there's two ways in which that comes forward. One of which, and this was really kind of highlighted by an email I got from my brother-in-law, Joseph J. Dixon, as a post actually on Facebook that you can find on our Facebook conversation, but also I'll so that. And one of these actually was really well, and one of these was really well spelled out by my brother-in-law, Joseph J. Dixon, in a post he made on Facebook in response to a question I asked, where he was talking about how one of the things that's weird about superhero media is that we fundamentally think of people as having superpowers in terms of their ability to do violence, in terms of their ability to be in confrontation. And he had suggested that actually, like, in a world of superheroes, you might think of like, a person with weather control could actually be incredibly helpful working with farmers and agriculture. But that doesn't really make for a Hollywood blockbuster in the same way. And in the same way, as we've often talked about, like Captain America and Tony Stark sitting in a room and talking back and forth about, well, should there be some accountability, but is registration too much? And what could different accountability look like? And how do we find a middle ground? And can we trust the government to do it, or should someone else? That doesn't make a big movie the way Captain America and Bucky and Tony Stark all punching each other does. And so we're kind of diving more into those questions a little bit and just kind of framing it that way. Just want to kind of start by saying, like, there's an extent to which we could peel open the whole superhero genre and say, like, well, but what if we went in these totally different ways? We're acknowledging that, yeah, the movies aren't going to do that. The TV shows aren't going to do that. But we still think it's important to ask these questions because, as you said, like, these are reflecting the real questions we're dealing with in our own world as well. And that's the whole point of this podcast.
Yeah, I will say that in the comic version of Civil War, both the characters of Daredevil and She-Hulk, because their day jobs as Matt Murdock and Jennifer Walters, they're attorneys.
Yeah.
So they actually like had, I would say, pretty big roles in like that desk job sort of way of not fighting or fighting in the court of law and challenging the Superhero Registration Act in various ways.
So one of my favorite Jessica Jones cartoon, one of my favorite Jessica Jones stories from the comic is about her dealing with a teenage girl who's pretending to be a superhero, because that's kind of like the girls who have superpowers as teenagers are kind of the outcasts, but therefore also kind of cool in like the high school way. And it's a great story, like getting into all those details. And you're right. I do think one of the ironies of all this is that in general, the wider you make the audience, the less likely you are to deal with depth and nuance, and the more likely you are to have really awesome explosions. Because that's just the kind of like mass marketing versus like a comic book or a novel or something like that can often explore a lot more of these things. And a lot of the TV shows we've been seeing, I think, understandably, like, get into a lot more of those nuances for those kind of reasons. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the questions we're dealing with. And Civil War starts with an incident, and I know it from the movie, and the book is probably comic book's a little bit different. I don't want to legislate exactly what Wanda did or didn't do, but I think that a situation like what happens at the start of Civil War is a good place to start this question of accountability. So let me start by asking you, Riki. Superheroes are out in the world. They have identified what they think is something bad. They are taking action to stop something bad. As a result of the actions they take, innocent bystanders die. Now, there's lots of questions about this of like, could they have done something so that those innocent bystanders wouldn't die? Would more innocent bystanders have died if they'd done something else? Obviously, there's all these questions surrounding it. What should happen next? In your mind, in a perfect world, what would happen next?
There should be an investigation
Mm-hmm.
and fact finding, and it should be determined by the investigating body whether the heroes acted in a proper way.
Yeah.
And how responsible they are for the deaths. So you mentioned the comic version. The comic version is like much more stark. No pun intended. It is. I can't even remember the name of the group, but it's like some throwaway, not the Young Avengers, but like Young Avenger type, like kids who have powers, like, and they are filming a reality TV show. So like that's the level of superhero they are. They don't care as much about the saving people. They're like doing it for the clout.
Right.
And they like, in trying to apprehend a super criminal, they cause, like, this criminal has like atomic powers and they cause him to explode. And basically like it goes off as a nuke and like a city is destroyed.
Right.
And that is the inciting incident of comic Civil War. So it's much more like of an irresponsible moment,
interesting.
Especially because it's like filmed, right? Like this camera crew is filming them, so everyone has the footage, and like these kids are like cracking jokes and stuff, and like, we got this, it's easy.
So the idea that like superheroes existing in the way that they do without any change is totally fine. Like that's just not a part of the like I think you could look at what happens in Nigeria and what happens to the Wakandan students, and there's an argument certainly of like, look, yeah, maybe Wanda should have been better trained or whatever, but like just let Cap and them handle it. That's not an argument that can even be made, it sounds like, in the comic book version. Like it's very clear something is not right with the way superheroes are getting to act.
Yeah, I think the movie kind of tries to parallel that by making Wanda the one responsible, because she's the newest member of the team. She's young, she wasn't a part of the Battle of New York, etc. So they're trying to frame it as like, well, she's inexperienced, but they never truly touch upon it in the same way that I think the comics were like, who the heck let these kids play superhero, right? That's kind of like the framing.
Yeah.
And that's how it's approached, of like, this superhero thing has gotten out of control. Because in the comics, of course, there's hundreds.
Right.
Whereas in the movies, it really is like this core dozen or so at this time.
Right. It's a much smaller group.
Yeah. So it's less so in the movie about like the idea of superheroes kind of getting out of control, I think.
Right.
And it's more like these people.
And it's interesting because I think I've talked about this before. I don't want to get stuck just too much on Civil War itself, but one of my frustrations with that is that it winds up pitting the idea of the Sokovia Accords against any kind of accountability. And where Cap winds up kind of standing behind a position of like, no, let us handle it. No one else should be thinking about it except us. And it sounds like, at least in the comics, there is some acknowledgement of some degree of accountability is probably good, but the Sokovia Accords are not the right way to do it. And it becomes a conversation about registration and all of that. Do you think that's an accurate description about what happens in the comics?
So I would say that there's two main differences in the comics version versus MCU. One In the comics, it is USA based,
Right.
like solely. It is like the US government saying we have to control superheroes. Whereas the MCU, the Sokovia Accords, is a United Nations resolution, right? So
Right.
it's an international agreement. And I think that's a very important distinction.
Right.
And then the second part, yeah, as you mentioned, it's about registration. Like the key thing, it's called the Superhero Registration Act. And it decrees that if you are going to vigilante or like legal anti, if you are going to act as a superhero to fight crime, then you have to register with the US government, which
Right.
includes, most importantly, revealing your secret identity.
Right.
And Spider-Man, Peter Parker, becomes the key person in this struggle because, you know, he's Spider-Man. Like he has kept his secret identity hidden for the, you know, the longest time amongst this community. And importantly for his character, because Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, discovered his identity, he targeted Gwen Stacy and ultimately murdered her. And so he, because of that incident, he holds his secret identity very closely because
Right.
he doesn't want, you know, now Aunt May or MJ to become hurt or targeted as a result of his activities as Spider-Man.
Right.
And that's like always been a part of his story. So he ends up revealing his identity in a press conference where he says, I'm Spider-Man, takes off his mask, and my name is Peter Parker. And he joins Team Tony in the comics.
Right.
And like that was like the key moment to me in comic Civil War of like, oh, like things just got real because
Right.
they did something that, you know, basically has never been done. Of course, probably
Right.
everything's been done at some point in comics, but
That's true.
it was to me, like the defining moment of Civil War in
Right.
the comics was Spider-Man revealing his identity
Right.
because it's
Right.
so key to the idea of the registration.
Right. And I think that's what it's important to frame it in those terms, because I think often this discussion of accountability, because of the way it's framed in that, jumps to registration. And I think one of the things I want to talk about is what are other forms of accountability and what it could look like. Because it sounds like, at least between you and I, we're in some agreement that like some degree of accountability makes sense. And you know, in terms of like whatever happened, you know, what happens in Nigeria, Black Widow does this thing, or the Young Avengers do this thing, whatever, people die. There should be some investigation, something happening with that. And I put this question actually to a lot of our listeners and friends of mine and stuff like that. And I got some great responses that I want to just kind of share with people. First of all, Manny Cavallari wrote in, yes, in the real world, anyone with power over others should be accountable for that power always. It wouldn't be any different for superheroes. Why would it? And related to that, Rob McKenzie, who's been a guest on the show a bunch of times, wrote, everyone wants oversight until they are the ones being overseen. Fantasy stories are like 90% power used without oversight, heroes for good, villains for ill.
Yes,
and I really
absolutely,
like
Rob.
the way both of those people are framing it in terms of like, overall, it seems we generally want some oversight. The problem is then when that oversight goes wrong or like it's problematic, or how should that oversight look?
Yeah, in general, I mean, I would say as for the MCU version, I would say I'm strongly Team Tony.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the comic version, I'm kind of like in the middle, maybe a little more Team Cap, right? So it's weird how like it changes based on the framing and what's
Right.
going on in the story.
Right.
But again, like this goes back to one of the key differences I talked about. In the MCU, the Sokovia Accords are an international agreement.
Right.
And I think that's very important because of like who are you held accountable by? It's like, well, what could be more high up, I guess, in the hierarchy of authority than the United Nations in our
Right.
current world, right? Like, of course, any governing body has flaws and issues and
Mhm.
stuff like that. But in general, I think we think of the United Nations as good
Mhm.
and a body that can be trusted.
Right. Well, I think it's really true, especially in terms of the metaphor that's being talked about, because in the when I think of superheroes, they are often framed as very American, in part because they're mostly the creations of American writers and American filmmakers and stuff like
Mhm.
that. There have now been a lot of comic books made outside of the United States, to be clear, and also Americans writing superheroes who don't come from the United States. But there's something very American about the ideal of them. And one of the things I think that gets most quickly problematic is the question of who gets to decide who needs help. You know,
Yes.
we start from this idea of that superheroes are there to help. Well, what does that mean? And I think another one of those kind of myths of, like I said, let me frame that. And like to back up a little bit, I think a lot of what we've seen with the story of comic books is kind of the story of mythologies falling. Like a lot of us, particularly white people in earlier in American history and stuff, grew up with this mythology of the president is always benevolent, even if we disagree with them, or the police are doing the right thing, the army's doing the right thing, and all these myths have fallen. I think another related myth is the idea of when people are trying to help, that's fundamentally a good thing. And then I think the problem is so often we don't ask, like, are we actually helping? And this is
Yeah.
everything from, this may sound weird, but to me, I see a connection between a person who randomly grabs my wheelchair and starts pushing it because they think they're helping me, and Americans thinking that they're helping the people of Vietnam or whatever Central American country or whatever, where it's the like, yes, obviously there's all sorts of like nefarious instincts, but some people generally are grabbing my wheelchair because they think they're doing good. And there were certainly a lot of soldiers who signed up to go fight the communists in Vietnam or South America, or to fight, Osama bin Laden in Iraq. Obviously, that's the misunderstanding there is intentional, because they thought they were doing good, And I think that's one of the most important questions is, like, the government of Nigeria in the movie of Civil War didn't ask the Marvel superheroes to come there and help.
Well, they
Captain
didn't
America,
even know. It was a
yeah, they
secret
didn't even know.
operation, right?
And I think that's why you're right, that it being international becomes so important, because Americans going overseas to fight the dangers that they think are happening in these other countries without talking to the people of those countries becomes real problematic real fast.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good intentional part of the storytelling of the MCU Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because around the same time in the comic book history, like 2000s, DC had a similar thing where there was like an international treaty saying that superheroes basically couldn't cross borders. And in the DC, of course, their Avengers are called the Justice League of America. So they are
Right.
like explicitly an American superhero body. And I remember this because the Green Lantern, Hal Jordan, kept getting in trouble because he kept going into like Russia to fight supervillains, and they're like, man, you can't do that.
Right.
Like there's an agreement. It's like, but like we have to stop these guys.
Right. Well, and like, yeah, that's a perfect example, because I feel like at the end of the day, with all of these things, one of the things that we're looking for is an authority we can trust. And then you also have to ask, like, okay, well, but who gets to decide? Can you always trust these authorities? And like, when I think about, to me, the idea of each nation gets to decide who does things within its borders makes total sense.
Yeah.
Until you then have a nation that's doing terrible things within its borders to its own people. And then do other people get to decide? And I've always thought there's a great metaphor here of like, it's not my job to decide if you are doing a good job raising your kids. I shouldn't decide if you're raising your kids right or not. And I shouldn't go into your house and tell you you're raising your kids wrong. But if you're beating your kids, then probably I should go into your house and try to stop you from beating your kids.
Yeah. And to be clear, like the I is very universal, like not you or I personally.
Exactly. Or you, certainly not, saying anything about you and kids or anything like that, or me and kids.
But that there should be a governing body that oversees parents in a way. But then like you get into the questions, of course, of what the difference between oversight and, I guess, surveillance, spying.
Right. And how do I decide? Okay, physically punching your kids is clearly abuse.
Yeah.
A lot of us think spanking is abuse. A lot of us don't. A lot of us think, you know, not vaccinating your kids is abuse. A lot of us do. Like, who gets to decide all those things? So pulling it back to that example we started with. All right, so Scarlet Witch has taken an action. Wakandan students have died. You talked about an investigation. Who should conduct the investigation?
I mean, in this case, in this world, I do think some kind of like the UN should form an investigating body,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I don't know how it works specifically, but they should be some kind of professional forensics and etc.
Yeah.
And I think there was a lot of footage from the fight and things like that. You have to get testimony from the people involved.
Mm-hmm.
And like for me personally, I think Scarlet Witch would be not held accountable in this case,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the villain had some kind of explosive, like poison gas thing. That's what ended up killing everyone. And he was going to detonate it in the marketplace.
Right.
And she threw it up into the air and it detonated against the building and killed the people in that building on that floor. But probably overall saved more lives than if it had detonated on the ground. And she was trying to diffuse it.
Right. Well, and I think to me that's exactly why an investigation becomes so important, because we don't know all the facts. Like, could she have thrown him up in a different angle so that it explodes in midair and not next to a building? I don't know. And that's my point. Is I don't want us to try and decide whether or not Scarlet Witch did the right thing. It's just I think we're both agreeing that like these are the questions an investigation should ask. And interestingly, I thought you were going in a different direction, because to me, and here again, I think this really mirrors situations. If, to pull it again into a, you know, kind of real world situation, if a trainee cop is there, you know, is put out into the street with very minimal training and given a gun, and then that cop shoots someone who they shouldn't have shot, well, you know, 50 years, 20 years ago, 5 years ago, even, we'd have probably just everyone said like, oh no, you know, blue line of defense, like thin blue line, whatever it is, protect the cop. Now it seems often there's an idea of like, okay, well, no, that cop was the bad apple, we'll push them out. And a push to say, okay, well, but who decided that this cop should have been given a gun and the authority to use it with only 3 months training or 2 weeks training or whatever it is? I'm pulling these numbers out of my ass. My point being, I would think, to me, I'd want an investigation to say, A, could Scarlet Witch have done something else, or did she minimize the damage by doing this? And it's perfectly acceptable that she may well have minimized the damage. But if you do say that there were better decisions she could have made, okay, is that her fault? Or is that the fault of Cap or someone else on the team for not training her enough? Did they give her practice situations? Like, were they trained in situations to think about collateral damage, stuff like that? Like, those are all the kind of questions that I think become so important, because I do think that the idea of when you have teams of heroes, we can blame the individual, but we can also ask, like, who gave them the authority to be out in the field and to do this work? And did they train them to be ready for situations like this?
Yeah, to me, like Captain America's character in this moment is very interesting and very telling, because first off, the explosion itself, like I always go back to Steve Rogers before he was Captain America, when the Tommy Lee Jones general character like throws a fake grenade when he's a skinny trainee, and Steve Rogers just instinctively jumps on the grenade to protect everyone else. And like that's the moment, one of those moments where you're like, oh yeah, he should be Captain America, like even before he gets powers, because of his heart, because of his instincts and how to help people. Right. So I see that parallel here where, you know, Scarlet Witch, I believe she did the best she could. Like, I'm not criticizing her actions, but her instincts were to throw it away rather than to somehow like use herself as a shield, right? And it was very interesting to me that Captain America is the one in that moment standing there.
Right.
And the other part of it is he takes the blame after the fact. He talks about like, oh, Crossbones mentioned Bucky, and I just kind of like lost focus and didn't clock that he was detonating an explosive.
Right.
And again, like that to me is like so telling of who he is,
Right.
as just Captain America, but as a leader of the Avengers. Like he's taking responsibility for the situation because he was the leader of this operation, and
Right.
he is not absolving Scarlet Witch of responsibility, but definitely like shouldering some of this blame because he recognizes that she's young
Yeah.
and inexperienced, and this could harm her psyche, right? And he's like, no, it's not your fault, it's on me, and
Yeah.
that's, that's what good leaders do in this situation when they recognize that.
Right. I mean, I've always thought that is so important. This is a weird analogy, but I think it fits here. Early in my career in the not-for-profit world, I was, as part of the staff of the nonprofit, there at a board meeting, and a board member asked about something that was connected to a mistake that I had made. And so I started to respond and talk about it and to take blame for it. And the president of the nonprofit quickly cut me off and then grabbed me later and said, listen, in front of the board, like you are my staff, you represent me. And so I am therefore at the end accountable for what my staff does. And so I am the one to take accountability, not you. And I was really struck by that. He could have said it a little nicer because he was kind of like, admonishing me for speaking up, which I understand, but I wish he'd been a little nicer about it. But like, even putting that aside, but I think he was doing exactly what you're talking about of Cap doing, of like, the leader should be held accountable. And that's, I think, another thing that gets into this here is like, yeah, like to what extent is it Cap's job to give oversight to Scarlet Witch and make sure she doesn't make a mistake like that? And therefore, is it his job to also decide, like, you're not ready to go out into the field again? I think one of the things that I kept waiting for and wanting in the Civil War movie, and again, we understand because it's not what the movie was about, is that moment where Cap says, I understand, Tony, why you don't want Scarlet Witch going back out into the field. I will at least take accountability for her. I will, if she goes out into the field, it'll only be with my oversight or with someone else like that. Like, the movie shifts quickly to Tony is behind this registration act, and we'll talk about registration in a minute. But I wish there had been some acknowledgement of, as Cap as the member of the team, I can at least acknowledge that something went wrong, and it's my job to work to prevent that from happening again.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the framing of the movie. This is what we got, but this is why I'm so strongly on Team Tony for the movie version, because everything that Cap says and does just kind of like feels wrong for the sake of the movie.
Yeah.
Right? Like Tony he does hold or orders Wanda to stay on the Avengers campus. And Steve reads that as like, oh, like you're incarcerating her against her will. It's like, no, like a person, who kills someone or people, and if there's an investigation, like they should be taken off of active duty while the investigation is happening, just to make sure that, what their level of accountability in the situation was and whether they are a potential threat going forward. I think that's just like a very fair thing.
Well, I think that this gets into one of the fundamental questions that happens because superheroes aren't the police. There's something fundamentally different, which is, as you said, like if a military person, if a police officer uses their weapon and causes harm, one of the things we generally think should happen is they lose the right to use that weapon while an investigation is going on. They're taken off of active duty. They're taken out of the field. They no longer are able to wear the badge that says, I have this state-approved use of violence.
Yeah, and I want to clarify, like doing harm, like specifically to civilians,
right?
Like especially for military, obviously in combat situations, you're not taking people off of active duty every time they shoot an enemy combatant.
Right, but even if they shoot an enemy combatant who's surrendered, you may well do that. If they, that kind of thing. You hope they would. You don't always do, depending on the situation, obviously. Well, so here's my question though. In all those situations, we start from the idea of we can allow you to be a person, but remove your ability to do extreme violence by taking away those weapons. With superheroes, we have the additional issue of by their very existence, they are a weapon.
Yes.
And like you said, you could just take Scarlet Witch off active duty. But and here, I don't. It's odd. Like I honestly thought you'd be a lot less Team Tony, and so I'm kind of wanting to being a little bit Team Cap here. Although just in this one instance, I'm kind of pushing back just on this idea of it would be one thing to say to Scarlet Witch, okay, we're going to take away your ability to do it. Like if she had like a magic hat, we'll say you can't wear the magic hat, but you can go back out into the world. But she is the magic hat. She has those abilities inherently to her. And so Tony's argument is not take her off active duty. It is keep her under house arrest. And I think I agree with that, but I'm pushing back now to kind of make us look at it. Is that fair to Scarlet Witch that just the nature of who she is, that she has these powers, is that therefore like she is the weapon that has to be we have to be protected from?
Yeah, I mean the issue is, as you said, you cannot take her powers away. And
Right.
also in this case, you cannot really take her identity away because the Avengers are such a public figure, you know, like celebrity status.
Right.
So if she were to go out try to go out as a civilian to Starbucks, she would get recognized.
Right.
And it would cause a media uproar. So yes, I do see the point that she is being held against her will on Avengers Campus. But I do think the circumstances of the celebrity status make it more complicated in this case. And I do still feel like it is the best course of action for her to stay hidden from the media, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, I'm not quite there, but I think I'm mostly there. You know, I do want her to still have more freedom, but also the like of some oversight, like with someone's protection or whatever.
Yeah. And I do think it is just part of the storytelling in this way to make her rebel, like to quote unquote force her to rebel and join Team Cap, Team Steve.
And I can already hear some of the responses of, oh, but wait, she did choose her powers. She did choose to go to Hydra. She did choose to be experimented on and stuff like that. And just to say, like, I think that gets into a very dicey set of questions about accountability and agency, and this is why, again, I don't want to make it specifically about those characters, but general to a more broader level, because certainly we have a lot of super powered people who have no control over the superpowers they got. I think one of the things I love so much about the Jessica Jones and Luke Cage stories is those are both people, especially Luke Cage, who are treated with suspicion because of powers that they had nothing to do with getting.
Yeah, and if you're gonna actually, I believe now the lore is that she always had magic, like because she's a witch,
right?
She always had magic, and the Mind Stone simply like unlocked her ability to access it.
Right. So let me actually shift to a different paradigm of this story that I think raises similar issues and get your thoughts on it. You have not seen Babylon 5, correct?
Not the full series, no.
Okay, but you've seen at least a little bit of it.
Yeah.
I imagine a lot of our audience has not. It is one of my favorite shows in the world. I'll acknowledge that it's very 90s in a lot of ways, the effects and the dialogue and stuff like that. It's not everyone's favorite. That's fine. I love it.
The effects are very Wing Commander.
Yes.
A video game from that same era.
And the dialogue can sometimes be a bit on the nose, but I think at times it's also brilliant. But moving past that, one of the things that it presupposes is that in the future, telepathy has become a thing that a small portion of humans are capable of, and that it's genetic. And that it is not something that people have control over, that they can learn to become better telepaths, but some degree of telepathy is just genetic. And that in that world, because people are scared of this, because people are scared of, if you can read my mind, well, what privacy do I have? What ability do I have to keep a secret from you? There are laws that are put into place for the registration and the control of telepaths. And that the organization that does this becomes very corrupt, and that's a whole other story. But just pulling it back just to this general question, in a world where some people have telepathic abilities, do you think that would have to be there? Like, should there be a fundamental control of that in some way? Or do you have to wait for, or do you have to sort of say that, like, yes, a person can abuse this power, but it's not fair to assume they're going to, and to put controls over that? And just to be clear, in the story, the idea is that you have to either join this telepaths guild, gotta get the League of Telepaths. What is it? The core. The core. No, what? Oh God, why can't I remember the name of it now? I'm gonna edit this out later. But Babylon 5. What the hell is the name of this?
This is how the sausage is made.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Those of you who are watching this get to see all the details. You know what? You don't remember what the name of this is? God damn it.
No, I don't. I did not watch it that much. I remember the telepaths and like Walter Koenig was the leader, or at least like
Psycore.
the
Okay, that's what I'm thinking of. All right.
main agent.
So in the world of Babylon 5, the telepaths have to join what's called the Psycore. And the Psycore is this thing that kind of like controls telepaths and regulates them. And they always have to wear gloves because like touch to touch contact is a lot stronger. They have to learn how to not read people without permission. They're not allowed to ever play poker or gamble because they can, if they can read someone else's mind at a poker table, how easy it is for them to cheat, etc. And if they don't participate in that, they have to take these very strong drugs that reduce their telepathic ability, but also kind of like reduce them in general and make them like their life pretty miserable, causing a lot of people to not want that. In the story, the Psycore becomes like very kind of corrupt and fights back against this and does really terrible things as well. But putting that aside, just start with this idea: human telepaths show up on Earth. Would you want there to be some kind of registration? Would you want there to be some idea of, because this person has the power to do great harm, we need some kind of control on that?
Yes. I think I'm pro registration. I don't know. I'm just gonna say yes for now and then like see what argument forms in my mind.
That's fair. I think for me, registration is definitely where I draw the line between, in that, and it's part of the point is that there is no human equivalent, but because like, yeah, even like the strongest person, like I can still have a gun and shoot like the biggest, strongest person and have some degree to fight back.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, I mean, like you have to register weapons or guns at least.
Right.
And so in some countries you have to register other weapons, I believe.
Right.
Japan has restrictions on crossbows.
But still, I as a person get that choice. And it's funny because now we've switched places here a little bit, but I am, I think for me, it's so hard. And I think it has to cause a kind of rethinking of what we understand privacy to be and all these kind of things. But to me, I am always going to say that I think there has to be a very strong line between controlling people based on what they do versus who they are or what they are capable of. And I think for me, that's where registration really hits hard, is the idea that like, because any person could do these things, they have to be controlled. That feels like it's a bridge too far to me.
The difficulty is like these arguments get used to register and control people who aren't threats.
Right.
Like that is the allegory that's being written here. And the problem when we're discussing it in a theoretical level is that in the real world, I'm more against that kind of registration and surveillance and all that. Like I understand like what's going on in these stories,
right.
But when you drop like people have psychic powers, I'm like, well, shoot.
Right. This may be a case where you're saying like the metaphor actually isn't a good metaphor because
the level of the power breaks the metaphor.
Right. No, I think there's some truth to that, and I think that's
what makes these stories interesting.
For sure.
Is when they are so extreme in this way that they cause you to look at your morals and say, actually, like maybe I am okay with this.
Yeah.
And then you go back to other situations like, oh, well, maybe I would be okay with that too. That's the point of these stories. That's the point of this discussion.
Right.
Like we should always be thinking about this just to be sure.
Yeah.
in my opinion.
And I think that takes us back to the question of accountability and who gets to hold people accountable. Because one of the things that I keep thinking about is that, and I think the movie Civil War really shows this pretty well, as does I think the comic book from Understand. And again, I don't want to get too into the details of that, but like the idea of, I think a lot of time, one of the myths that I think has been being broken down, especially in more recent years, is the idea of the objective observer. That there could be some group who is just like, think about like how legislative districts are drawn up and the question of gerrymandering. We used to talk a lot of it should be an objective, nonpartisan body that draws the legislative districts based on just decent standards. I don't know if I believe that exists anymore. I think we should try to get close to that. But like just the question of what is a good standard is going to be debated in both bad faith, but also in good faith. And the idea of there being people who are just completely unbiased, I think is hard to imagine. I do think the idea that it being like the American, I think we can kind of agree that like the police being the ones who decide if a police person did something wrong is kind of problematic. The American government deciding that. Like I don't know if Cap is a fundamentally trustworthy person. So is Superman. But I'm a big believer in that you can't make rules based around your trust in a paragon, because oh God, what's the name of the guy who Falcon's real name?
Sam Wilson.
Is Sam Wilson as trustworthy as Steve Rogers? I think so. Certainly seems to be for the most part. But American Agent definitely isn't. And what about the next person? What about the next person? And Superman certainly isn't if anyone gets near him with kryptonite or red kryptonite. The point of all that being, like, I think where I come down a lot is the idea of accountability has to have a number of factors going into it. And Andy, another person who wrote in on one of Discord's in on this question, talked about how maybe accountability should more like be like a Bill of Rights kind of thing, like a set of laws and ideas of here's the guidelines that superheroes have to follow, rather than a group that's only accountable to. And I kind of think that like a Bill of Rights is important, and then also there needs to be both internal and external accountability. There should be Cap looking over and saying, "Hey, are we doing this in the right way?" So the Martian Manhunter saying to Green Lantern, "Are you doing this the right way?" But also some degree of external accountability as well. And where the exact balance of that is, well, that's the next TV series I want to see. But to me, it's like I kind of look at those three things in tension of internal accountability, external accountability, and some kind of written document that is agreed to of these are the standards by which we're holding people accountable.
Yeah. I believe, like pulling back to way back, I believe accountability obviously is important, but should not be in the hands of, as you said, like the people who are involved. So accountability for the Avengers should not be in the hands of the Avengers. Like they shouldn't decide. It should be a separate body, and it should be as distributed as possible, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
So again, like that's why I fall so firmly on Team Tony's side, because I think, as Don Cheadle's character Rhodes says, it's the United Nations, right? Like,
right.
What higher, like more distributed body do we have in this world in terms of accountability currently?
See, and I guess, but I'm always, like, I do want Cap and Cap's group to have some part of it, and it's in our own world. I have to look at the police and the military, who've been spectacularly bad at this. And I think it's easy to acknowledge, but I also think that particularly when we're talking about who people are rather than just what they do, I want the group that is having controls put over them to have some say in what those controls are. And that's where I think also why, to me, it becomes much more about, like, I think
I think like a representative makes sense.
Yeah, well,
like Black Widow being like, she ends up being kind of a representative individual in all of this.
What and like I think you said something that's really key, and maybe I misunderstood it. But in the comic books, am I right that you don't you don't have to register just because you have superpowers? You have to register if you are choosing to use those superpowers. You're basically claiming the right to go out into the world and use your superpowers for your understanding of good.
I think that's the original intent, but I do think that they go too far and go into like we need to register anyone with superpowers, and that gets into like the mutant question and all
Right.
that.
Right.
And of course, like, and the reason like I am not on Team Tony in the comics is like he keeps going too far
Yeah.
in the comics. Like he like registers everyone. He incarcerates. He incarcerates supers who don't register. I think is what ends up happening. Like him and Mr. Fantastic have like a supermax prison in the negative zone.
Right.
And when that comes out, like of course, like all hell breaks loose, and like they break into the super prison and free everyone, and that's like the big fight.
Right.
And ultimately, like Teen Tony wins, and he institutes I think they call it the 50 state initiative, where basically like there's a super team in each state. And it's all like state controlled, like by the US government. And it really like sets the tone of this scary, like authoritarian world.
Yeah. I mean, because certainly the idea that like the government's going to do the right thing or the government's going to be accountable because we have democracy, like that's not always the case. And yeah, to me, I think that's more we talk about. I think that's the line I'm really coming down to is like, if you volunteer and say, I want to use my powers to do good, then I think there's some legitimacy to saying, okay, but you don't get to decide how to, like, there's going to be some oversight to how you decide what is and what isn't good and what powers you do or don't use and what is the acceptable level of collateral damage for that.
And it makes sense to register your civilian identity in that circumstance, because if you take an action that causes harm, that they need to know whose door to knock on to say, hey, like we need to have a chat.
Right.
We need to investigate this incident.
But Femi, would you agree with this? If I have super strength and I decide it's not my business to fix the world, I'm just going to use my super strength to help my friends move and to like, carry big things and help little old ladies with their groceries and maybe like, help move a building or something like that. But I'm not going to try and go fix the world. I don't think that person needs to register.
Yeah. Probably. Yeah. Again, like when we get into these, it's like which superpower is the problem, right? And going back to the mind reading, like I think mind reading is always a problem, just because of like what you can do, kind of even passively with it.
Right, and especially because like one of the things I think that they set up so well in Babylon 5 is this idea of that you're like you said, telepathy is not active; it's passive. It's that I can't. If I am an uncontrolled telepath, you might be thinking in your head, like, gosh, Matthew's new hair dye looks really terrible. Through no action of my own, I will know that you thought that. And so it's not like I am now violating your privacy without any intention whatsoever on my part. And I think that's a really interesting way of framing it, of like, what if a person by their very nature, without any agency on their part, is causing these things to happen? How do we look at that?
Yeah. I mean, so with the mind reading, I would just go to like a very simple case of playing a game of poker.
Yeah.
Right. Like obviously you're going to win and like win a lot of money. And it's a low harm situation, right? Like you are not physically hurting people, but you're stealing. Like it's stealing, right? And that we regulate and enforce against other forms of stealing. So that would need to be enforced, but then like how do you enforce telepathy?
Right.
Or how do you even detect for telepathy, right? Like that's why I think the telepathy one is really a problem.
Yeah.
Is if you don't have any means of detecting for it, then you just don't know how people are using it to like cheat in very mundane situations.
Right. And I think that you can look at I think you can look at it as stealing. I think I also would look at it as cheating at a game. And so to me, I think you could also think of it as like kind of equivalent to steroid use or something like that. But that also gets the case, like if the idea is to say that everyone should be on a level playing field, I think it is a fair understanding to say, let me back that up. If you start by saying that if you have a superpower that makes you physically able to do things that most other people can't do, and therefore gives you an unfair advantage at a competition, then Michael Phelps should have been banned from Olympic swimming. Because he is probably the closest thing we have seen in our world to a superhero or having a superpower. In that he,
I classify him as a mutant.
Yeah.
In like the very ordinary case of mutation, where like
right, I'm a redhead. That's a mutation.
Human race is constantly evolving, like on small, like micro scales, and
Right.
he was a micro scale. And if you 1,000 years later, he's like Aquaman.
Right. And yeah, and it may be that in evolution, and we all become it. And there's a whole lot of stuff about Michael Phelps there. That's not just that there's like something about his biochemistry affects the way he breathes and his ability to hold his water longer under his breath longer underwater and stuff like that. It's very complex, but yeah, no, I think it's a really good way of seeing it. All right, so we've fixed this question. We've solved everything. We're at about an hour. Any other last kind of comments or thoughts or questions you want to bring up in terms of this overall question of oversight and accountability versus registration and all the rest of it?
Well, I want to end off by saying that it's very interesting the way Marvel uses Captain America. And I don't even think I mean like Steve Rogers specifically. I mean like Captain America, the overarching symbol or character across multiple individuals. Because again, like we are seeing in the newest movie, Sam Wilson, Captain America, is once again butting heads with authority. And it's very interesting to watch how both the in-world people deal with that, but also how real world people react to it, because Captain America, in the name, it's baked in, right? But oftentimes like writers of the character or performers who portray the character say things about that name and say like it should be about more than America, and people react to that in very strong ways. But I think he's basically Marvel's Superman. And we had the same discussion about Superman with Jess about truth, justice, and parentheses the American way, and how that's been added and taken away from that phrase.
Right.
And so that these like super like the moral paragons of these comic worlds should be about more than any one individual country. It should be about humanity.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good way of ending it on, is that in a lot of ways, I think the question shouldn't be, does Steve Rogers or Clark Kent need accountability? It's more the idea of, because I think in the 1940s, if you said America uses its power for good after America had defeated the Nazis and Imperial Japan, I think a lot of people would have said, yeah, that's a fair statement. I think if you'd look deeper, you'd say, okay, actually, America did a lot of horrible things as part of defeating those two, and that comparing Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, like it's apples and oranges and should be thought of in two very different ways. But then I think that led to, therefore, when America acts in the world, it's doing good. So America must be doing good in Korea, and must be doing good in Vietnam, and must be doing good in Grenada and Nicaragua and El Salvador and all of these places. And very quickly that becomes not the case. And to me, I think it all boils down to this idea of we can't make the rule for the paragon, and there being some degree of accountability, someone else who can look in and say, and I think, because not to open up a whole can of worms, but I think it's kind of as a closing thought, but please respond as well. I think people often think accountability requires malfeasance. And I think that that's really dangerous, because I think, yes, there are definitely people who claim to use their power for good, but are clearly using it for evil. But like, to use a real world example, I think Dick Cheney wanted to invade Iraq for the benefit of Halliburton and oil companies and all these things. I think George W. Bush genuinely believed he was making the world a better place by overthrowing Saddam Hussein. And I think, frankly, many heroes are a lot closer. We want heroes to be Dick Cheney. I think most heroes are problematic people. I think we want them to be like Dick Cheney. We want them to be Emperor Palpatine, rubbing their hands and going, "Mwah, ha, ha, ha." But in reality, they're much more like people who think they're using their power for good, but no one's ever said to them, "Hey, wait a minute, are you actually helping? Have you asked if those people want to be helped? Have you thought about how much collateral damage you're doing?" And to me, that's what accountability is. It doesn't have to be registration. It doesn't have to be control. It's someone saying, "Hey, wait a minute, are you actually fulfilling the mission that you claim you're fulfilling, or is something else happening? Are you doing more harm than you're actually helping?"
Yeah, asking that question and
Yeah.
asking for an explanation. I think when it comes to, especially when you talk about civilian accountability over like a military or superheroes,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes there's like a shorthand from those people who it's like, well, you wouldn't understand, like
Right.
because you've never been in the military or you're not a hero, you weren't there, right? And that idea of you wouldn't understand, help us understand.
Yeah.
Right? That's part of what I think of as accountability is like discussion and explanation.
Right.
And if you can explain this situation in a way that makes sense, then okay, like maybe
Yeah.
we allow it or we absolve you of responsibility for these deaths. But you have to stand before someone and explain this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you are just a like the problem is like in DC's Injustice story where Superman becomes a dictator. He doesn't have to explain to anyone. I guess Wonder Woman
Yeah.
sometimes, but ultimately he's just like, I make these decisions, like you have to do what I say. He becomes a
Yeah.
dictator. No one can stop him because he's
Yeah.
Superman.
And that's why, although it's presented heroically, Cap saying, when the whole world says you should move, you saying no, you move. Utterly, so many people cheer, and it
I hate
utterly
that line
terrifies me.
so much.
Yeah.
It's like, no, why? Maybe you should have a discussion and ask, like, why should I move? Like, can you
Yeah.
move? Like, can we like walk past each other?
Yeah. Or can we both discuss, are there legit reasons why you want me to move? Are there legit reasons?
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway,
That
well,
line is so ridiculous to me. Ugh.
Ricky, I'm so glad we had this conversation. This has kind of been at the heart and soul of so much of what why I care about this podcast. And to our members, I really want to hear what you think. You know all the ways to find us. Let us know. Thank you so much for being members. Ricky, thank you so much for being part of this great conversation. May the force be with you.
No, you move.
And we're out.